I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of what we call deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. And you can also stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments. We cover a wide range of intellectually stimulating, engaging, and timely topics, and they're distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. Our guest this episode is Ethan Elkind, who directs the Climate Change and Business Research Initiative at both UC Berkeley School of Law and UCLA School of Law, and he holds professorship appointments at both law schools, and also directs the Climate Program's Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, and is author of a book called Railtown. It's on the history of the Los Angeles rail system. And busy lad, he also hosts a weekly radio program in San Francisco called State of the Bay on KALW, an NPR affiliate. He's a graduate of Brown and has a JD degree from UCLA Law School. And I welcome Edith Elkind to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to have you.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be with you.
Good to be with you again. And let me, first of all, extend my gratitude to you and also my kudos for all the work you've done. You're out there working systematically and working constantly and in ways that really have results. And we'll talk about that, I hope, in the course of this interview. But I just want to mention, before we begin to talk, because we're going to focus a lot on climate change, that there's a little plug on the website. You can go to some previous interviews on climate change, one going back with Bill McKibben, who's famous in the world of climate change, number 9 of our website, and Molly Kawahata, who is climate advisor to the Obama administration. That's number 29. And Dr. Christine Dahl, number 69, who is a senior climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists. But now we have Ethan Elkind, and I'm really, again, delighted to have him with us because he's got an extraordinary amount of knowledge to share with us. And if you have questions for him about climate change or anything else that we bring up with the environment, we welcome your involvement in the program and encourage you to join us. I thought we'd begin by talking about the fact that some of these goals have been falling short, especially 2030 goals on greenhouse gas. And I know that must be a bit demoralizing, but it prompts me to ask you about a kind of report card. Do we have anything like, a nuclear clock that tells us just how a lot of people don't want to hear about doomsday and climate change. In fact, they'll turn the channel when they hear those things go together. But do we have a sense, at least measuring where we are now and where we need to be?
Yeah, the problem is that unlike a nuclear bomb, which is basically one horrible outcome, there's a range of outcomes that are potentially possible when it comes to climate change and falling short of our greenhouse gas goals. So any progress we can make makes a difference in terms of the worst case scenario. And there's a wide range of those scenarios. So there's a big difference between 2 degrees Celsius of global warming versus 5 or 6 or potentially 8 degrees Celsius of global warming, which would be catastrophic. So it's really a series of gradations. And then in terms of kind of holding ourselves accountable, that's really fallen to the environmental nonprofit groups. You mentioned Bill McKibben, 350.org. That's one strong metric right there, carbon parts per million. That's one metric, but may not really communicate that much to the public either. This is what makes it challenging, that it's hard to communicate that we need to be doing as much as we can, and there is this range. So it's not necessarily a succeed or fail kind of situation.
I know you're not in the messaging side of things for the most part, but we could be talking more. I mean, I watched Republican convention. I didn't see anything about or hear anything about climate change. Democrats had a young guy named Maxwell Frost from Florida who came up and said some very strong things. And there were some things about clean air and clean water in Kamala Harris's nomination acceptance speech, but not a lot. And I think part of the reason is the public doesn't necessarily respond favorably.
I think the public is concerned generally. I mean, the public is obviously diverse, but there is strong concern around climate change, and it ranks high on the list of issues that people do care about. But it's just not going to compare with those immediate concerns that people who are struggling with all sorts of day-to-day challenges in their lives. It's not going to rank that high. If you're worried about losing your house or your apartment, if you're struggling with healthcare, if you have basic economic concerns, day-to-day concerns, substance abuse, those are going to loom so much larger in people's lives than what feels like a far-off kind of a challenge. I mean, I've heard political scientists describe climate change as essentially the perfect storm of political science problems, because you've got this massive global issue where any one individual can't really do anything by themselves. It requires, to some extent, a certain degree of sacrifice, and the people that we're trying to save are mostly in the future, not now. So from a messaging standpoint, from a sort of rallying people around this cause, it's one of the most challenging, if not the most type of challenging issues to work on. And I think the ways around that are really focusing on the immediate benefits that people will receive if we can achieve some of our climate goals. And so that's really what we've been trying to focus on. How will it make people's lives better in the here and now? How will it provide them jobs? How will it save them money? How will it clean their air? The things that are tangible and real and immediate to people.
Yeah, that has to come across. And also the work that you've done, I mean, things actually can be accomplished, and people need to know those kinds of things and how they can be accomplished. Let's talk about environmental law and climate change, because you've made some real strides.
Yeah, I think that part of the story does get lost. I mean, and it's easy to get lost when you think about, the extreme weather events that are happening, the kinds of suffering and the kinds of scientific projections, particularly those worst case projections. It's easy to kind of get lost, and this is a losing issue for us. This is one of despair and gloom. And so we lose sight of the tremendous progress that we have made, particularly on technology. And I can cite a couple of those. I mean, the big one to me is battery technology. That has progressed so dramatically. We've seen 90% and more cost reductions in these lithium-ion batteries that go into electric vehicles. And the projections going forward are that we're just going to see continued innovation, which means, just from a personal standpoint, when we think about trucks or our own, passenger vehicles, shuttles, et cetera, that can benefit from turning to electric propulsion and relying on these batteries, it means much cheaper vehicles that can go much greater distance. When we think about how those batteries then can add to the electricity grid, because the other big innovation is the incredible decrease in solar panel costs, wind turbine costs coming down. So we're getting cheaper, low cost, zero carbon power. But we know that kind of power isn't very reliable. That's where batteries come in. They can store that power and allow us to operate a grid when we need it, when we need the lights on, when the power demand is there. We can store that energy through with batteries. So I think those two technologies, and there's a whole host of others, but those are really, in my mind, the big ones: the renewable energy progress and the battery progress. It's unlocked a whole kind of host of innovation, and really enabled us to imagine that we can achieve a low or zero carbon economy and not sacrifice anything. We still have the appliances and the lifestyles that we want, but we can do so in a lower carbon way. And I don't mean to imply that it's completely without sacrifice, but this is actually achievable without grinding our economy to a halt.
Well, and we're moving forward with more electric cars, but that necessitates minerals and other kinds of things that make a carbon imprint.
Yeah, that's a big part of the discussion. And we call them transition minerals, because, we're operating from a world where oil and gas production is dominant. And that's a global enterprise with incredible environmental impacts, negative environmental impacts. I mean, I think that's obvious to pretty much everyone. You think about the oil spills, you think about the oil rigs, you think about the pipelines that break. And what we're needing to do now is transition to minerals that will supply those batteries. So that's lithium, that's in some cases cobalt, that's graphite. I mean, there's a whole kind of laundry list of these minerals. One thing I'll say to put this in some context is that the amount of minerals we need and the amount of mining that we need, even in the sort of best case low carbon, mid-century economy, is a fraction of the amount of oil and gas production that's happening now. And those minerals will enable the decommissioning of that really harmful oil and gas infrastructure. So that's one important context. But it does mean that we need to be careful about how we do the mining going forward, making sure it doesn't go to those countries with the least protections for human rights, for workers, for local environmental impacts. And it's something that we're working on at our center. We're working with advocates all over the world on this issue.
There's a lot of mining reform going on, isn't there? I mean, from the government.
Well, we need more. We need a lot more mining reform. Even in the United States, our mining law dates back to the Ulysses S. grant administration. Has not been updated. In badly needed reform. But we do have better protections here in the United States than in many other mineral producing countries around the world. But there's more attention, I would say, to the need for mining reform. And I think this is actually an opportunity because it's not like mining is just invented recently with the need to transition our economy. Mining has been going on for thousands of years, and it's always had local environmental impacts, and there's been abuses associated with for a long time. So the hope is that this opportunity now creates a window for change, long overdue, needed change in the mining sector, and finally do it in a much more responsible way that includes community buy-in, community participation, community benefits, and isn't just more excuse for business as usual.
We're going to go to some of your questions momentarily. We're talking with Ethan Elkind, and again, as I said before, we do want to hear from you. What about this word lifestyle? Susan Sontag said a long time ago should be retired, the word itself, because you want to have a life rather than a lifestyle. But people have to change, and there's a lot of resistance still. There's a lot of, I don't even mean necessarily climate deniers. Like you say, it's not in the present, so it seems remote from people's lives, and they don't like to hear about the doom and gloom and so forth. How do we get people off their butts?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it doesn't require actually much change or much sacrifice for that matter. I mean, when we think about the electricity grid, which is maybe a quarter, sometimes a third of emissions in a lot of places, most people don't really know where their electricity is coming from. If we transition those to low cost, zero carbon sources, that's no change for them. Electricity is still flowing. And in fact, maybe we can build an even more resilient electricity grid because we can have more distributed renewable energy that's not just having a central power plant powered by natural gas or coal. So that kind of change is invisible. But there are other changes that will require, or other policy needs that will require some lifestyle changes. But I think a lot of these are for the better. And I can give you one big example, which is how we build our communities. Because for so long, we've been building our communities around the car. I remember one of my professors of land use in law school made a comment that, if an alien came down to visit us in, a suburban, let's say, California community, they would think that the species is not humans, it's actually cars, that we've arranged everything so that cars are as well treated as possible. They have their own indoor place. I mean, we have a homelessness problem, but we don't even seem to have that problem for cars. We have nice places for cars to sleep, but not for people, unfortunately. So if we can reorient our neighborhoods around, more convenient, walkable, transit-friendly layouts, giving people the opportunity to not have to get in their car for every last errand that they have to run. And it's especially important for people who can't afford a vehicle, can't drive for any reason. And this also simultaneously addresses the housing shortage that so many of our high opportunity cities are suffering from right now. We can build more housing, but do so in a way that's more convenient for people, more compact development, where their heating and air conditioning bills aren't as high, their commutes aren't as long. So that's an example of lifestyle. I know maybe we don't want to use that word, a change in how we live that I think brings a huge amount of additional benefits beyond the climate benefits of reducing emissions from transportation, from electricity, water, if we're in houses that require a lot of irrigation and heating, et cetera. So I think that's an example where it's not sacrifice, but it's change.
Speaking of water, I was just reading about this desalination in southern Spain. I mean, they've got all the water they need, and they're pretty positive that it's going to continue that way. And it's extraordinarily optimistic in terms of what they're able to do. Of course, it's also very expensive.
Yeah, and the problem with desalination is that it takes a lot of energy to essentially get that salt out of the water. So I think water is maybe analogous to energy in a lot of ways. We want to be as efficient as possible with it, and so thinking about water, a little less of the focus that I work on. We've got a water program at CLE headed by my colleague Mike Kaparsky, who's done a lot of great work on this. But we want to make sure we're being efficient with the water. We're limiting our outdoor irrigation needs. We're being smart about our agricultural production. California is kind of famous for growing really water-intensive crops that make a lot of money for farmers, but really not well suited for our water situation. But then, of course, we also want to recycle our water. Anything else beyond that, any additional supplies, that's where desalination can be really important. So water, I think, energy have a lot of comparisons there in terms of needing to be efficient first before we generate new supply.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. And California still remains pretty far ahead. I don't want to get too geographic centric here, but the fact of the matter is there's been a lot of progress in California. And there are third world countries that feel still resentful. We've moved so forward in terms of using our carbon imprint and continuing the carbon imprint. And they say, hey, it's our turn, and I understand that kind of feeling of equity and feeling of being, shall we say, shortchanged in some ways.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest challenges of all, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big dynamic, particularly when we get into these international negotiations around climate. So the UN, every November, December, there's the conference of parties, these big the UN climate conference that goes on, and this is the common refrain. If you're a developing country, you're trying to raise your living standards, provide good jobs for people, give them the conveniences that people in the developed world have enjoyed for a long time. There is a lot of frustration. You guys created this problem, and now you're expecting us to curtail our development potentially. So that equity issue definitely, gets raised a lot in the international context. But it's even worse than just a few countries have created the problem. It's actually there's a few people within a few countries that are the real high emitters. I mean, it's true in essentially any developed economy that the truly wealthy people, the top 10%, are disproportionately responsible for the emissions. And the sad part about climate change is that as we're seeing these impacts, these extreme storms, weather events, flooding, the droughts, it's affecting people with the lowest incomes first. They're often living in the most vulnerable places or have the least resources to withstand the climate shocks.
Excuse me, Ethan, we also have to add landslides, which now have increased because of climate change. I mean, something new. And also, what are we going to do about all these endangered species? I mean, now climate change has exceeded or passed, I think, it's hard to believe, but poaching in terms of, iconic endangered species within, say, the next generation, so many, about a third of them will be gone.
This is one of the arguments for really taking this issue seriously as possible. We're living through a great die-off, a great extinction right now, and we need nature. Nature is actually one of the best carbon sinks out there. And as we think about trying to meet our climate goals, there is a recognition that there are going to be some sectors of our economy where we're just not going to be able to decarbonize anytime soon. Actually, airplanes is one of the issues that I work on, where there is no real, single technology solution that people think are, is truly proved out in terms of being able to replace relying on fossil jet fuel. So we're going to need to bury carbon that we've already burned and emitted into the atmosphere. We need to take that out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground, basically. And there's mechanical ways of doing that, but there's also using nature, natural processes. So it's important that we have ecosystems that are healthy with the diversity of species that we need, because the plants that are part of those ecosystems are doing a natural job of capturing the carbon. And then there's different practices that we can put into place as humans tending to these natural environments to make sure that the carbon in the plants gets buried in the soil, not burned and put back up in the sky. Although prescribed burns are something we do need to do to some extent. But there's all sorts of nature-based techniques. It's called in the climate field, about using nature, harnessing nature to help us undo some of the damage that we've done since the Industrial Revolution and even before that.
Well, this is a little outside your bailiwick, but I can't help but want to ask you, when you mention airplanes, you have any thoughts about the kind of criticism you hear of people who are very strong environmentalists but rely upon airplanes to go just about everywhere?
Yeah, the climate shaming. My general take on this is that we're not going to solve climate change by asking individuals to just personally sacrifice in some way. This is a systemic problem that's going to require systemic solutions. And I do encourage people to, use their purchasing power, use whatever decisions they can make in their own lives to try to reduce their carbon footprint. I think a lot of it is through purchasing power if you can afford it, getting an electric vehicle if you have to drive, or, getting rid of the natural gas appliances in your house, recycling food waste, and if you can cut down on airplane trips, that's a good thing for the climate. But the reality is it's just not a viable solution to tell people, you should feel guilty about flying. What we need to be doing is putting in place the policies to make sure that when we're flying, 5, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, maybe there's a zero emission option that's been deployed, or at the very least, we're requiring that the fuels that go into our current fleet of aircraft are low carbon fuels, and you can blend in biofuels, low carbon biofuels. And some of the airlines have pledged to do this. They're not really moving that quickly on it. But that all takes policy action. That's all systemic. So I don't think climate shaming people is going to solve this problem, because making people feel bad about a flight that they're taking.
Is there anything on the horizon other than what's going on with batteries that really gets you excited, that looks promising either in technology or maybe as a result of AI?
Well, AI in some ways has been bad on the climate front because it's sucking in so much energy for these AI server farms that they're building. Now, maybe there's going to be an upside for AI. I think there's some interesting applications on the climate side, but I think ultimately I'm more interested in the built environment and some of the technologies related to that. So I think some of the technologies around getting rid of natural gas in people's homes is really interesting. Induction cooktops, for example, magnetic induction cooktops, which we got in our home, and I think is a vast improvement over a gas range. Also, heat pumps, another technology that enables people to get rid of their gas water heaters, get rid of their energy sucking air conditioning units, get rid of their gas furnaces, and create a much more efficient way to get hot and cold air into homes. So that's a technology. And then this one's kind of perpetually out there, and I'm a little bit more mixed on it, but it's hydrogen. And I say I'm mixed on it because hydrogen right now is created by fossil fuels for the most part. And so people might feel good about using hydrogen like in a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, but ultimately they're just using natural gas or something worse in a very inefficient way to get to the hydrogen. However, I'm optimistic that we can have some breakthroughs on producing hydrogen from surplus solar and wind energy. So you get to truly zero emission hydrogen. And then there's a lot of applications for that hydrogen. I think actually transportation in some ways is the least of them, but certainly for industrial uses and even for things like aviation, there's a lot of interesting research and deployment going on using hydrogen to fly in a zero emission way in an airplane.
Yeah, I remember when Schwarzenegger was governor, everything was going to be turned to hydrogen somehow. Where are we on renewables now, though, as you see it?
So I think they're making incredible progress. We're seeing states like California, we're on track for, by law, we have to get to 60% renewable energy in our electricity grid by 2030. We're seeing huge progress across the United States on this. And I think it all goes back to that innovation that I was talking about, where the price has come down so dramatically, and it's become a bipartisan issue now. So, Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which really kind of continued and accelerated some of the support for renewable energy like solar and wind. And it's now in so many states that you see, political leaders from both parties really supportive of it. But the other interesting thing about renewable energy is that we're going to have to overbuild, right? We're going to have to overbuild the amount of solar, amount of wind we have so that, we have enough energy on those peak days. And what that's going to do is give us at certain times of the year a huge amount of surplus electricity. And we can do all sorts of interesting things with that extra electricity, including making a lot of hydrogen, which you can then store and use for those dark, windless winter days when we can't be relying so much on solar and wind. But basically, I think we're on track to exceed a lot of the original estimates around renewable energy. The prices have come down dramatically, and it's just enabled a whole host of interesting innovation and technology really all around the world.
Well, since you're talking about winter days and enduring them, I'm mindful of the fact, just heard from a friend of mine who's in Arizona who said every day has been about 115 degrees. And he said, as far as climate change, what's going to be like 10 years from now or 20 years from now? We're going to have 130-degree Hades weather, every single day? Or
Yeah, there's a great book that just came out called The Heat Will Kill You First, which I recommend to your listeners. And the title says it all. I mean, when we think about...
For upbeat reading, right?
Actually, it's pretty fascinating. It does sound a little dark, but that'll hopefully grab you and make you want to read the book. But there's a lot of interesting innovation going on around this. But there's no question that, the most dangerous aspect of climate change, other than someone getting caught in a devastating storm, is these rising temperatures that we're seeing. And I'm concerned it's going to make certain parts of the world essentially uninhabitable. I mean, we're almost getting there. So I mentioned the international climate agreements and conferences that go on. There was just one in Dubai last year, and I got to go to it, part of our work through UC Berkeley. And I was talking to some of the folks. I know Dubai already bans outdoor working between certain hours of the day in the summer months. I think it was like noon to 4 p.m. And we're already seeing that actually in places like Arizona. I mean, this is pretty traditional that if you're doing a construction job, you're getting to that job site really early and you're hanging it up, midday to avoid the worst of the heat. But it's going to get to the point where having air conditioning is going to be essentially a human right and an absolute necessity. Right to cooling, it's referred to, because when you're out in extreme heat, there's no shade, there's no amount of water you can drink. It gets to the point where you're literally starting to cook from the inside. I mean, you can cook meat at 120 degrees, and that's essentially what we are as human beings. And so we're going to have to figure out ways to make sure people have emergency and reliable access to places where they can cool themselves down and avoid the heat in the middle of the day. But if you look at these trend lines, Arizona, Las Vegas, parts of the Middle East, in India, it's hard to imagine at this rate, these are really going to be inhabitable places, at least, throughout the year, without strong interventions like ubiquitous air conditioning with reliable electricity to support that air conditioning, because you don't want to get to a situation where the power goes out and people are going to die. We're going to potentially get to the point where it's not going to be habitable to live in these places.
And more of these less inhabitable places, the more migration we're going to have as a problem, right?
Yeah.
That's just simple equation, yeah.
And we're seeing all this already. I mean, this is not even a future scenario. We're seeing deaths from increased heat increasing dramatically from extreme heat, and migration from these disasters. I mean, as you see these more intense storms that we saw in the United States, Hurricane Katrina, fueled by higher temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico. And, hurricanes have always happened, but they're made more intense and more frequent, as the scientists tell us, from climate change, warming waters. And when cities are destroyed, when areas are flooded, people leave. And sometimes they'll come back, but sometimes there's no place to come back to. And you think about that on a global scale. I mean, there's even an argument that a lot of the migration we've seen from the Middle East, North Africa into Europe is in part driven by climate change, because that was underlying some of what's caused some of the political instability in those parts of the world. And that mass migration is incredibly destabilizing. It's created a strong backlash. It's created its own sort of form of violence within some of these communities. So it is definitely a big issue. Actually, the same argument in the United States about why we're seeing a lot of immigration from places like Central America, that there's been a lot of increase in extreme weather events, natural disasters that have forced people to think about coming north to the United States to have a more reliable, safe future. So these trends were already happening, but climate change is potentially accelerating them, and I think will accelerate them going forward.
Ethan Elkind is our guest. Let me go to some of your questions, and thank you for the questions. This first one from Stephen in Chicago, he wants to know, where does nuclear fit into climate change solutions?
So nuclear is famously a zero carbon source of electricity. However, it has other negative, or can have other negative environmental effects, mainly the nuclear meltdown issue and radioactivity and radioactive poisoning from the meltdowns. And of course, those are, pretty rare, but when they happen, they're high profile and people die and get sick, and it makes a lot of headlines. So
you've got the nuclear waste to worry about and be concerned about. Yeah.
The nuclear waste as well. Right now, we're just storing those, spent nuclear fuel rods on site. We tried to figure out a place to store them in Nevada, but politically nobody wanted the spent fuel rods, on a train through their communities and then stored out in Nevada. So there are some, I would largely characterize them as political challenges around nuclear. I don't think it should be taken off the table, especially some of the smaller scale nuclear reactors that are being pioneered. Bill Gates, for example, is funding some of this deployment. I think the main issue, though, is that politically, it's very challenging to get a nuclear plant sited in places like the United States where there's so much opposition. And given that political reality, given the reality that you need, pretty big public subsidies in the form of insurance for these facilities, because the private market is not going to insure these facilities. To me, it's not really a viable strategy politically to rely on it. And when we have these other technologies that can produce zero carbon electricity without the same level of controversy, with solar and wind coupled with batteries and other energy storage, it just feels like, why try to fight the political tides on this?
This is Skip from Phoenix, kind of a statement. We'll get your response to it. He says, most sustainability initiatives stop short at the point of engaging people. There's plenty of talk about what needs to be done, but the momentum falters when it comes to actually driving awareness, adoption, and change. Yet people will change, even if they don't do it for the right reasons initially. If you can guide them to act for the right reasons and reward them along the way, then you've tapped into a winning opportunity.
Well, I think there actually is a fair amount of outreach. It really depends on the program. It's hard to generalize. But in California, one of the things that we focused on here is, for example, in low-income communities in particular, it's really helping to support what we call community-based organizations, nonprofits that are based in the community with people working there who are from the community, to be essentially ambassadors. Explain to people, you know what, you could get a used electric vehicle for about the same price as used gas vehicle, and you'll save this much amount of dollars. And here are the programs that you can qualify for. And here's where you could charge the vehicles. So that kind of outreach and education is really important, but it has to be done by trusted messengers. That's just one example. There's other, programs, outreach on ways to make your homes more energy efficient. Get an energy audit and see if your home is leaking. Your air ducts are leaking and you're wasting a lot of money in addition to energy. But we can only rely on outreach and persuasion so much. I mean, the most effective solutions we've seen on the climate front have really been mandates on businesses to clean up their act. That's where we've seen the most amount of progress. We wouldn't have electric vehicles, for example, without the mandate that California put in place on automakers to produce them, which helped create the market conditions for companies like Tesla and Rivian and some of these legacy automakers now to actually start producing them and help bring the cost down. Same with renewable energy. We required utilities to build it. And I think ultimately we're going to get to the point we're going to have more requirements, phasing out fossil fuel production and requiring homes to be more energy efficient, requiring natural gas to get out of buildings where it's dangerous and polluting anyways for our indoor air. But it does take a lot of different policy approaches. There's no one policy that's going to solve it. Even with those requirements on businesses, we need subsidies for research and incentives for consumers if there's a higher cost associated with the transition. So outreach is part of it, but it's not going to solve it just by itself.
A kind of appropriate question from Jane. Thank you, Jane. She's in San Francisco. She wants to know, when will the SEC require publicly traded companies to report on their Scope 3 emissions?
Well, that's a big issue. I don't know if people are in the weeds on SEC and Scope 3, but there's different classes of emissions. There's the direct emissions that a company might be responsible for, and then there's a sort of indirect emissions from their products or services, and that's what that's referring to. We've seen the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, try to act to require large companies to disclose their essentially the climate risk, their carbon footprints. And that's gotten a lot of pushback. I mean, this is an issue that Republicans were right at the get-go and have been trying to prevent. So, I don't know. I think it's going to take a lot of political will to get that done. Maybe if Kamala Harris gets elected, we'd have a new SEC chair, maybe new political dynamics. But, disclosure is important, and the federal government is important. But I also think, in my experience now working on this issue for over 15 years at UC Berkeley, there's a limit to what you can really rely on the federal government to do. It can provide money. It's pretty good at that, tax credits, subsidies. But the federal government, in a way, is sort of the laggard, right? Like, we have a federalist system, and it's the states that, on every big issue that's faced this country, it's the states that have led first. Whether it was Massachusetts and Romney Care kind of laying the foundation for Obamacare, or the civil rights movement, and environmental movement, the states are going to have the political will to get things done and then change the conversation for the rest of the country, provide an example of success that then can inspire the federal government to act. So we certainly need to see federal action. I'm not trying to minimize that, but just from a realistic perspective, it's states like California that have passed a law requiring disclosure of climate risks and climate impacts from different companies, big companies doing business. And that's the kind of thing that forces action, because otherwise waiting for the SEC to act means you might be sitting around for a while, unfortunately.
But issues of land use get into all kinds of state versus federal, federal versus state.
Yeah, land use, actually, it's kind of worse than that in a lot of ways. It's a very local issue. We have a very decentralized form of governance in this country, and that's by design. We value individual rights and freedoms and input from different participants in a community. But, often what happens at the local level is determined by, 5 people on a city council, or in a rural county, 5 county supervisors somewhere. And they often have veto power over transmission lines that we might need, on a national level to get renewable energy from one area to another, where, like Wyoming, where there's a lot of wind, to cities like LA or Salt Lake City, et cetera. And they often have veto over things like high-speed rail, which we also need to build, take pressure off our airports and highways, et cetera. So the land use side is really tricky. We've seen more states now start to intervene and essentially take veto authority away from local governments. We may need the federal government to do something similar on transmission lines, where federal government has authority to permit pipelines for natural gas, but not for things like transmission lines, where we need those transmission lines to unlock a lot of renewable energy in this country. So this gets into the complicated system of governance that we have here, and just the nature of having so many veto points, trying to do things by committee, by consensus. And maybe in the old days when we weren't dealing with this, the urgent challenges of climate change, we could sort of afford to do that. But at this point, it's urgent that we reduce emissions as much as possible. We've wasted a lot of time. We now have the technologies, and we need to deploy them as rapidly as possible. And that means, cutting out some of these veto points in the process along the way.
Yeah, it comes to mind, of course, that the Republicans are trying to make abortion into a state issue, and to some extent seem to be succeeding, but that's for another day's discussion. I want to go to some more of our questions, and actually a comment from Dennis in Albany. He says, is there some point where we just acknowledge that regardless source of climate change is simply going to happen and we should look to cope with the impact?
Absolutely. I mean, it is happening. We've already seen a certain degree of temperature increase since before the industrial age. We're already seeing impacts. We've already seen some sea level rise, for example, not as much as people had anticipated because we've seen different changes in the ocean responding to that. But there has been, just in the last 100 years, a rise in sea levels. We're seeing these extreme weather events. We're seeing things like, extreme droughts, and then, a whiplash to extreme rainfall events. So we're already dealing with these events, and we're going to continue to deal with them. Even if we shut off, all emissions today, which would also mean we've, ground our economy to a halt or something else calamitous has happened. So it's not, hopefully it's not going to happen. And it's also not feasible to do. Even if that were to happen, we've locked in a certain amount of warming for a number of decades to come, if not more than that. So we know we have to adapt. And the key is to do so in a way where we're protecting the most vulnerable, the people who don't have the resources, the incomes to adapt, and also to try to do so in a way that can help us also accomplish the goal of reducing emissions. So if part of the adaptation is that, we've got to relocate a highway, why don't we think about building a transit line, in that new relocated highway, for example? Or as we're thinking about how we're going to be building new communities to make them more resilient, let's build them in a way where people don't have to drive for everything, where they're closer into where the jobs are located and the services, the grocery stores, so we can reduce transportation emissions in the process. So that's really the key. But absolutely, we need to adapt as much as possible, be as resilient as possible, because the world of climate change is already upon us.
Since you mentioned transit, and I mentioned that you wrote a book about the history of Los Angeles rail system, Judy from Denver says, wasn't Los Angeles once a leader in mass transit?
Yeah, the whole city was built around streetcars. In fact, that's part of why it's such a big, sprawling city now. The real estate barons were the ones who originally developed that streetcar network. So they bought up huge swaths of land in LA, which had great weather, relatively flat, especially once they channelized the LA River there. But then they had a challenge pre-automobile. Why would anyone want to live this far out of, say, downtown LA? So they actually built the transit for people. They built streetcar lines as a way to boost their property values and sell more lots. And so LA was a sort of like spokes on a wheel kind of a city, where the spokes were the privately owned and funded and financed streetcar lines. So it had a great system, but then unfortunately, in a lot of ways, for traffic and air quality and other things, once the automobile was developed, I kind of liken it to like the iPhone of its day. Like, it just took off, and especially in LA, where the weather's great and people were already living pretty far out from their jobs and relying on a streetcar network that they were frustrated with. The streetcars were slow in many cases, and they were jacking up the prices, and then the streetcar operators would go on strike. So they weren't loved by everyone. And once people had access to a car and you could just bypass that streetcar and get where you wanted to go, it took off. What people weren't thinking about was that if everyone makes that choice of driving, you're going to get what we have now, which is gridlock and a lot of air pollution problems. So that was really the tragedy of LA. However, the good news is, if you're a transit fan, is that a lot of those rights of way, those tracks, they're still there in LA. A lot of them built over, but it's kind of fun. You can go on Google Maps if you're a nerd like me, and you can see the lines still there. And in some cases, the LA's transit agency was able to buy up those rights of way. And now we've got the new modern LA system actually using some of those old train track right of way.
Are you hopeful on that score that they're going to move more that way? And
I
Actually,
am, well, yes and no. I am in the sense that LA has the most ambitious and well funded rail development program in the country, if not the world. The voters there have already voted 4 times to increase sales taxes to fund rail. So they're building out a pretty large network. The problem is twofold. One, it's just the size of LA. With the Paris Olympics, there's been a lot of comparisons to Paris and LA. But Paris is something like, I can't remember the exact stats, but it's like 50 square miles of urban density compared to like 300 in LA. And I may be getting that wrong, but it's something along that order of magnitude. And so, when you have a city that large, a geographic area that large, and worse, you have people going in all different directions, it becomes very hard to build a rail transit network that's going to work for everyone. And then the other factor here is just that rail is never going to serve everyone's needs. And it's much more important that LA develops a really robust network of bus only lanes and bike lanes too, to give people multiple ways to get around where they're not going to have to be stuck in traffic and they can get where they need to go much faster. And if it's, enjoying the nice weather that LA benefits from most of the year, outdoors on a bike, it's a lot more fun.
a question from one of our regular listeners and question submitters, Reed in Santa Rosa, California. How can we inspire the wealthiest population in the world to help fund improvements in climate technology and assist people who can't afford to make the necessary changes? Thank you, Reed.
Well, I think it'd be hard to inspire them. And although we have seen, folks like Bill Gates, and some of the other, Bezos, for example, has a Bezos Earth Fund, and his ex-wife is funding a lot of climate adaptation and support for, lower income community groups on the environmental justice side. We're seeing, certainly the sort of billionaire class, if I can refer to them that. There's a number of representatives there who are funding a fair amount. But inspiration is only going to take us so far. Ultimately, I think if you really want to be able to get their resources dedicated to solutions, you need a different kind of tax policy.
And rolling up your sleeves, I'm afraid, too, is part of it, part of the picture. Here's a question from Sarah. This seems to come up in climate change discussions. How important are mangroves to slowing climate change?
Yeah, mangroves.
They matter.
Yeah, they do matter. And I should say, not an area that we've, researched, but from my knowledge of this, they've been really important at providing a buffer against sea level rise, against major storm impacts, also important just for ecosystem health. And there have been some interesting studies with some of these major hurricane events that have come in, that areas that have been able to preserve their mangroves have really been able to withstand a lot of the climate impacts much better than areas that had cleared their mangroves. And actually, even going back to the tsunami, a number of tsunamis that we've had, those mangroves are really important as buffers there too. So even beyond the impacts of climate change, although sea level rise will make a tsunami more devastating too. So yeah, there's all sorts of species out there that are our friends, and we're going to need them. So we need to be doing more to give them a safe and good place to prosper and thrive.
I've been reading about something that maybe you can shed some light on: corruption in the electric vehicle beltway supply chain.
I have not read anything specific on corruption. I mean, there's been a long history of corruption in the mining sector in general. So I don't know. I mean, nothing I've seen in the work we've done on battery supply chains indicates there have been some scandals, yes, but this is part and parcel of a long-standing dynamic, especially in some of these lower income mineral producing countries where you've got large companies with a lot of resources from Europe, the United States, coming in, and now China actually, and offering a lot of sweetheart deals, a lot of corruption. So the corruption scandals that I've seen in the mining sector are just sort of writ large and not necessarily tied to electric vehicles. However, as we're scaling up these new sources of demand for lithium and nickel and cobalt, there's kind of new opportunities for scandal and corruption. But corruption is a really important issue to think about in general as we're thinking about a more secure supply chain. Because, rightly so, a lot of the headlines are about things like child labor and, the local environmental impacts and pollution. But corruption also is a major challenge because it undermines so many rights, and undermines the economics of these projects, and is ultimately kind of a tax on everybody when that happens.
So when you think about what can be done to ameliorate the corruption problem, what comes to mind?
Well, some of it is about specific reforms in the mineral producing countries. A lot of it is about daylighting transactions, trying to have much more transparency. And there's been some interesting work at the international level around some better standards on mining in general. So IRMA is one of them, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It's a voluntary standard, but it's got buy-in from a wide range of stakeholders and industry, and it provides things like audits on some of these facilities and adherence to standards around things like corruption. So we're seeing a lot more attention being paid to this, and ultimately it needs to be daylighted, and there needs to be reform at the mineral producing country level and also at some of the international levels. The downstream buyers, need to have some assurance that they're not buying minerals. Minerals aren't in their supply chains that are coming from corrupt deals.
Question from Bill in Portland. Thank you, Bill. How important is large-scale food waste composting in fighting climate change? Most places seem very behind on this.
Food waste is a big issue, mainly because food waste creates methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And if we could get rid of methane today, we would buy ourselves a lot of time on climate change.
Some people are more concerned about methane than other gases, in fact, that we've been concentrating our...
Yeah, there's a strong reason for that, which is that it would really make a big difference for our long-term efforts if we could cut out methane in the short term, because it's such a powerful greenhouse gas and only really lasts for about 20 years in the atmosphere, but it can do a lot of damage. So we could buy ourselves a couple decades if we could reduce methane emissions or eliminate them even. The other thing about methane is that it's a product. It's something that we should, oil and gas industry, for example, leaks a lot of methane. That's losses for them. So, there's a lot of ways we can sort of work with industry to help reduce methane emissions, but they also come from food waste. Food waste, as it decomposes, will lead to methane emissions. So we could be doing a lot more on that front. Then there's a lot of different approaches to that. Unfortunately, we throw out a huge amount of food in the United States. So some of the approaches might be around education. Some of it might be around having some real strict targets around trying to reduce food waste and really trying to put in place some systems that can help make sure that people, buy more efficiently, and educating people that you can actually use food in your fridge a lot longer than the expiration date often will say. So there's some interesting recipes I've seen online for what you can do with, yogurt that's old, milk that's old. And also, like I say, we may need to think about this more systemically. There are states like California that do have laws in place around food waste and methane. It's a hard subject to tackle.
Well, we'll stay with food and California for a moment, because Steve from Sacramento says you mentioned water-intensive crops in California. It seems like we need to help educate people to eat local, but to also eat climate-friendly local food.
Yeah, this is maybe another example of that sort of tension between systemic reform and individual choices. I do think it's great if we can educate people about, eating locals, if they can afford it, if the supply is there. I mean, we have many low-income parts of our country where they're called food deserts. There's no grocery stores. There's no fresh food available. So we can do a lot more on that front. But when it comes to, which farmers are growing what type of crop, that's really a systemic issue. We have the policy and economic incentives in place for growers to be producing crops that take a lot more water than what's naturally provided. And, they can pump groundwater. It's only started to be very loosely regulated in places like California. So these are real systemic issues around what's being produced on the food level. Education outreach to people is important, but again, that also requires systemic reform to make sure that people, the best low cost, most delicious option to them is something that's local and fresh and relatively low carbon as well.
And a question from Paul in Miami. Thank you, Paul. How does work from home affect climate change? It seems like working from home would be good for the environment.
Well, initially, when COVID hit and everyone was working from home, all the people who could, I should say, work from home. It takes someone who's, doesn't need to be out there on a construction site or delivering things to have the privilege to be able to work from home and the security to do so. We saw pretty major climate benefits because vehicle miles traveled, the amount of driving people were doing, which just plummeted. Now, of course, we're still kind of figuring this out, but we seem to have settled into this more hybrid work environment for, the keyboard economy folks. And actually now the evidence is a little bit more mixed, because while we're not seeing the commutes on a regular basis, we are seeing people running a lot more errands in their local environment, maybe errands that they wouldn't have run as much before. Maybe it's an excuse to kind of get out of the house and they don't have to be quite as efficient, pick up things in one trip when they only have a little bit of free time, before and after their commutes. The other thing is that we've seen transit ridership really plummet, and people who are going back to work often are not getting back on the trains, they're driving. So we're seeing increases in traffic now from people who used to be riding the transit systems. Not totally clear why that's happening. Could be that traffic did go down, so that encouraged people to drive, and now they're kind of in the habit of driving. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag, but I would say, ultimately it could be a real positive, at least on the driving miles, if we kind of arrange things better. Again, if people didn't have to drive for every errand, and lived in a more compact home where it didn't take as much to heat and cool the home during the day when they're at home working. Those are all other strategies we need to put in place to really maximize the environmental benefits of working from home.
Using more computer power too, of course.
Yeah, more computer power at home as well. And so thinking about efficiencies with that. There's a lot of pluses and minuses, I think, when it comes to working from home, but we just need to kind of do it right. One other potential upside is that we have a lot of vacant office space, right? Even as we go to a hybrid work model, it seems like we just need a lot less office space in general, which is bad if you're in commercial real estate. However, there's opportunities to transition those empty office buildings to housing. In some cases, not really viable, but there's a lot of opportunities there, and we need more housing, especially in our cities. It would be a way to revitalize some of our downtowns and potentially save our transit systems too, because so many transit systems were built specifically around moving office workers, from home to their desk. And now that they don't have that market to rely on and ridership has fallen, replacing them with people who are living in these downtowns and converted office buildings could be a way to save those transit systems and continue to get those climate benefits.
Well, I've alluded to all that you've done on the environmental front, and we've learned an immense amount from you just in this time that we've had with you in terms of climate change. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about a Native American nonprofit that you co-founded. This is looking for tribal justice. What are you doing on that score?
Yeah, so this is something I started actually when I was in law school. It's called the vis-a-vis Institute, which is a Hopi word because our first project was based out at the Hopi Indian Reservation in northeastern Arizona. It means in a friendly way. And it's a nonprofit. It's a Native American nonprofit. I'm not Native myself, but working with Native Americans to help get that started. Working with tribes to help improve their governance systems, basically, and specifically on things like tribal courts. Moving some of the disputes that go to tribal courts, moving those to mediation, which in communities like at Hopi, that mediation is more closely associated with their traditional form of dispute resolution than an Anglo-style court system where there's one winner and one loser. The judge makes the decision up or down. And so having mediated outcomes can often help resolve a lot of these disputes that in many cases are intergenerational, across the tribes, across villages, and hold up things like, economic development and who can inherit the home and who can plow that field. So that's a project that I'm very proud of, vis-a-vis Institute. And it's still going, working with my colleagues from UCLA Law School on that. And actually that experience working with tribes has been really helpful on things like the battery supply chain issues, because the stats on what percentage of our mines are near tribal reservations is pretty astounding. I mean, it's often tribes and tribal communities that are on the front lines of mining impacts. And in some cases, that's a real positive for them because there's not a lot of economic opportunities in these very rural tribal communities. But in many cases, it means that all the local negative impacts are essentially foisted on tribal communities, while all the economic benefits are going to large companies, large mining companies, and people who don't live in the tribes who get to enjoy a cheaper, electric vehicle or whatever the product might be from these mines. It's not just electric vehicles. So it's helped me understand a bit of the tribal perspective and working with tribes as they're engaged on these mining debates.
It's also what's come to be called environmental racism.
Yeah, environmental racism and environmental injustice, and the counter is environmental justice as a movement. But it's the idea that so much of the brunt of climate change impacts, of just environmental pollution in general, falls on people who are not just low income, but often non-white communities, predominantly non-white communities. And we have a long history of segregation in this country. Even outside of the South, where segregation was enshrined in law, though it was in northern states as well. States like California, we had redlining, where if you were non-white, you wouldn't qualify for a loan to buy a home in neighborhoods that just happen to be the cleanest neighborhoods, and now often are the most climate resilient neighborhoods. Not always, but typically. So the only places available to people who were not white were to buy, next to a highway, next to the port, next to an industrial facility where they're getting the brunt of that pollution. And so the protections are not in place oftentimes for those communities. And that's really what launched the environmental justice movement to counter that environmental racism.
I don't know if the name Ted Rozak resonates with you. He was a historian, a friend of mine, wrote a famous book called The Making of a Counterculture. He actually gave that name during, well, the counterculture's birth and, shall we say, presence in so many things. And he wrote an article about a number of years ago about how difficult it was to do triage in the environment because there's so many issues that really face us and challenge us. If you were talking to, say, a group of young people and they wanted to know where to put their resources and what part of the environmental movement, what would you tell them?
Well, I think the most important thing I always tell students is do what you're passionate about. If you really love what you're doing, you're going to do a good job at it. And if you don't love it, it's going to feel like work, and you're probably not going to distinguish yourself and really contribute. So, think about what you're most passionate about, number one, and then try to match that up with what's needed. Where the urgent needs and where your skill set can really make the biggest difference. When we think about what we need to do on climate change, there's a lot of good resources out there that catalog where the emissions are, for example. So that's what you care about. I want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You start with those big sectors of transportation, of electricity, and then you can get down to some of the sectors that are going to be really hard to decarbonize, how we think about decarbonizing those. We've got technologies for electric vehicles and solar panels and wind turbines, geothermal, et cetera. But what about industrial sources? So you could put your efforts there, thinking long term. If you care about, the impacts on specific communities, environmental justice, maybe you want to be thinking about how we do a better supply chain for batteries. Or maybe we think about adaptation. Maybe people are passionate about, we know we're locked into climate change and extreme weather to some degree. How can I protect communities that are truly vulnerable? So I think it really depends on the person, because there are so many issues out there, and we all just have one life to live and lead. So we got to, use that as effectively as we can and choose something that you're passionate about. Or maybe it's a whole host of things. I work on a lot of different topics, and there's some advantages to that.
And they're all interrelated, aren't they?
They're all interrelated, and we do need people who can see the connections between, solutions in one sector may inspire a solution in another sector. But I think ultimately you got to do what you're most passionate about.
What about better transportation? Let's at least talk about that for a moment before we conclude, because you did a whole book on the metro system, and I know you've done a lot of study of transportation, not only in urban areas, but how do you do better transportation those people who don't have the availability of ease with transportation who are out in remote areas?
Yeah. In remote areas, the other issue is that those are the people who drive the most. They actually have the most to gain from having a more efficient way to get around. And it takes multiple types of solutions. Rail is really only appropriate for really densely populated places. In the outlying areas, you can have buses, but you can also have shuttles. I was out actually working with the Naquatziwet Institute. I was out in the Eastern Sierra, which is a very remote area. I needed to get to the airport in Bishop, California, which is a tiny airstrip. And I was staying in a motel a couple miles away. They just have transit on demand. I just made a phone call, and the county has a service. Really nice shuttle driver came over, picked me up on the street corner. Had to wait maybe 15, 20 minutes. Wasn't that bad. And I got a direct ride to where I needed to go. And so for a rural community like that, having those sort of on-demand, lower energy, lower impact types of travel options is important. But we also don't want to lose sight that rural communities also can be very walkable too. There's downtowns in rural areas. They may not be as big as, a big city, but you can build, walkable areas that are car-free, even in a rural area.
What mostly keeps you up at night, and what are you hopeful most about?
What makes me personally the most concerned, or sad, I should say, is, I think this might be true of a lot of people in the climate fight, and maybe in general, is that there are certain places on Earth that I just love from a sort of natural beauty perspective. Certain places in my neighborhood, places I've traveled to that are just beautiful spots. And the types of species, the plants that make up the character of that place. It's sad to me to think that, everything's time limited on Earth, but that we've greatly accelerated the demise of places that I particularly love. So that makes me personally, sad to think about. It makes me feel like I just want to enjoy what we have while we have it. And I've got kids, and I want to expose them to it and just teach them just appreciate it while we have it. But from a broader perspective, I worry, just to get down to nitty gritty, I worry about things like elections. I worry about backlash to some of the progress we've made. I worry about, For example, if when Republicans come into office in the White House, they try to revoke what California can do, our sovereignty on things like requiring electric vehicles. And so those kinds of policies just have huge ripple effects because what we're doing in places like California are creating markets and templates for policy action that can inspire worldwide change. So I do worry about the politics, but there's a lot we can all worry about. So I do want to emphasize just how much progress we've made and how much we still have control over the future and the outcomes, because they're definitely not certain. They're not defined yet. It depends on what we do right here and now.
And you remain hopeful and passionate.
I just try to get the work done. I mean, hope is good if it's going to motivate you in the moment. There's no need to despair. We have a lot of work to do, and people just need to figure out what they are able to achieve in their own lives and capacities. And if they can't do anything, then it's on us, the rest of us who can do something, to try to help as much as we can.
Well, you've done a lot, and I certainly am grateful for all that you've provided for us. It's been very enlightening and illuminating to talk to you in every way, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it.
I want to thank all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, or on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, I invite you to join by simply going to the website, graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes. I mentioned a few having to do with climate change at the beginning of this episode. I also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me directly at mkrasny@graymatter.show. I want to thank our great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to our guest, Ethan Elkind. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.